Day, everybody. I almost always say good morning because I am recording this in the morning, but you're watching this anytime that you get a chance to. So I always say good day, but so anytime I begin to say good morning, now you know why. But welcome to chapter 6 of the Gospel of John. We are cruising our way through this gospel. I mean, it's 21 chapters, and so we're up to chapter 6. So if you've come along this far, congratulations. We are getting through this quite well. We're into this really famous passage about the feeding of the 5,000. And there may be some little details that I just want to lift up to you that maybe you haven't picked up on, because in the Gospel of John, the feeding of the 5,000 is an important text in that it's going to distinguish again between those that believe and those that don't believe. Unlike some of the other Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000 is this miracle story where people get fed and they come to believe in Jesus. But watch the progression in the Gospel of John, because it begins right away with an important statement that the people are following Jesus to this mountain because of all the signs that Jesus has been doing. This is John giving you a hint that these followers probably are not the true followers of Jesus. They're there to see another miracle, to see another sign. They're there just because Jesus heals people, so they just want their people healed. But the sense in the Gospel of John is these are not true believers. And I think that's important to lift up, that this is a crowd of people who are there for Passover. This is the second Passover that we have. And keep Passover in mind, as I've been saying, the connection to Moses is throughout the whole thing. But there are 3 Passover narratives. And so we're in the second Passover, hence the second year of Jesus's ministry. And so these are pilgrims that would have been coming towards Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. And so there's large crowds. And often they're painted in sermons and whatnot as positive groups. But John is painting them a little bit as negative, because it's the crowds that will call for Jesus's death. It's the crowds that stop believing. It's the crowds that do this. So kind of keep that in mind, that the crowds here are there not because they truly believe in Jesus, and that'll become apparent throughout the rest of the reading, but because Jesus heals. So they're not quite true believers. And as Jesus looks out at the crowd, it says, and this is where John is kind of fun, because John makes little comments, and sometimes in the NRSV it's in parenthesis or different ways, but he kind of pops in as present John when he's writing, looking back at past Jesus and makes commentaries. And so John says, in order to test, he asks this question, how are we going to feed everybody? And then the reply, of course, is, well, we six months' wages couldn't possibly do this. Pay attention to numbers. Anytime numbers are kind of mentioned, I always say pay attention. 6 is incompleteness. So 7 would be wholeness and completeness, as would 10. 6 is incompleteness, 1 minus 7. And so the response is we are incomplete, in other words. There's no way that we can possibly do this. And so when Jesus calls to search the crowd for what's there, we find there's 2 fish and 5 loaves. But the only thing that's specified is not the fish, what size fish or anything like that, but that they're barley loaves. This seems insignificant, right? You and I wouldn't really care what kind of loaves that they are. But imagine it was for the modern reader, but there's 5, and I hate to put it this way, but 5 Wonder Breads or 5 Sara Lee breads. Barley loaves were the loaves that were for those that did not have a lot. So what we might call for the poor or for the undernourished. Barley was not the good loaves, in other words. These were not the ones that were perfect. And that's why I kind of use Wonder Bread, because I remember when we didn't have a lot when I was growing up, Wonder Bread was the loaf of champions, so to speak. And so the idea is that these are loaves for the people, that these are not the primo loaves, but these are the ones that are mainly for the poor. And we get a sense that the fish aren't gigantic either. So we're not talking about gigantic loaves that are well nourished or anything, but loaves that are for the poor, and probably smaller fish. So when Jesus gives thanks and gives it out, and then there are 12 baskets full afterwards of leftovers. 12 is again a significant number. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. But the idea is that each basket is filled with both fish and loaves, that it's not just one has disappeared, but there's so much left over that it's enough to feed a whole nation of people again. So what Jesus has transformed, which was food for the poor, essentially, Jesus has transformed into abundance for the people. Now, there's a debate, and there's a good debate. It was part of my class discussion even. Is this a foreshadowing of communion? You can certainly say that, because the dialogue that's going to happen just later when Jesus talks about eating bread and drinking blood. So is the feeding of the 5,000 a foreshadow of communion? Or, and I'll give you my answer to the question, I thought it was a callback to manna from heaven, because Jesus is going to talk about Moses, and Jesus is going to talk about manna and the bread that doesn't perish. And so there's a big question. Is Jesus talking about the Old Testament? In other words, here's the sign that has been done in the past. Or is Jesus talking about what's about to come into the future? Or both? It's okay for it to be both. But we were given a choice in my class about pick one. Is it Moses or is it communion? I happen to lean towards Moses because of the dialogue that immediately follows. But I'll leave it up to you as a Bible study follower. This feeding of the 5,000, is it meant to be a communion image, or is it meant to be a manna from heaven image? Either way, the point being is that Jesus has taken and fed the people enough. And this is why I leaned a little bit towards the manna image, is when it was manna from heaven, people could just take what they needed. But if they took too much, it perished. But if they took what they were needed, everybody had enough to feed them to feel satisfied. And so the language throughout John is the feeling of satisfaction and feeling like they had enough. And yet this happened in front of them. It didn't appear out of nowhere as it did in the Exodus narrative, but appeared from their own offerings. That again, there's abundance, there's overflowing, just like the water into wine. That is the whole point. When God is present, there is abundance and everybody is well fed, and there is enough for all, no matter where you are in life. And so as you're looking at that, just kind of keep that there. Immediately it says that they want to make him king, and Jesus gets a sense that it's there. And Jesus rejects that notion. This is not Jesus' mission. Jesus' mission is not to become the new Caesar. It's not to become a king like David. Because if you remember your Old Testament stuff, God didn't actually want the people to have a king. Because what a king does is take power from people and take resources from people. This is a different type of kingdom. And so Jesus rejects that notion and runs away. And we get the next probably big event, and that's the walking on water event. You may want to try to bring in a different gospel, where it says that the disciples thought he was a ghost walking on water or something like that. Here in the Gospel of John, the disciples are quite sure that it is Jesus walking on water. And that's something to note. And the response that Jesus has to them, there is no Peter walking on water. If you notice, that's not in this gospel. Because when the disciples are afraid, if you're reading the NRSV, it might say, I am he, or it is I, or something along those lines. The actual response is, don't fear, it is I am. Significant because, again, Old Testament, Exodus, God's name is I am. When Moses asks what God's name is, it is I am. And so throughout the Gospel of John, the words I am will appear. In fact, it's also the very next text. But that's the response that Jesus has when Jesus walks on water and the disciples are afraid. Have no fear, it is I am present. God is present with them. And the idea is that this is something different. The disciples have not seen something like this before, hence the fear, as an awesome fear too, that it's not that they're terrified and afraid that way, but that they're also in awe of the power of Jesus. So then the crowd doesn't understand how Jesus gets there. Because they said that whole thing with the boats and there's only one boat, and how did so they have to figure out how Jesus got there. And what's interesting is this is the same crowd that just saw the bread and the loaves and were fed by Jesus. And look what they asked for in verse 30. Jesus says that you need to come to believe. And the people immediately ask him for a sign. They just had the bread and fish. Isn't that a sign enough? That's what I meant, that John is not painting this crowd in a positive light, that they're a crowd that is just there to see sign after sign after sign after sign. They want a miracle worker. They want somebody to kind of entertain them. They are not believing that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of Man or Son of God. In fact, they're going to start to turn on him instantly, because after they ask for a sign, Jesus begins to talk about being the true bread. I am the bread of life. I am is important in there, right? And their response to some of this is the same as the woman's. Please give us this to eat, or more of a demand, give us this to eat forever. And again, talking about eternal life. Eternal life is on the here and now. It's not something in the future. So if you are eating the bread of life, you will see the presence of God in the here and now, and then be raised up on the last day. It's not, I'm going to be raised up and have eternal life. Look at the progression. You will have eternal life and then be raised up on the last day. So Jesus once again uses an I am statement here. I am the bread of life. And then in verse 41, he starts to lose the crowd. They're going, no, this is too hard. This is difficult. This is blasphemy. That's ultimately going to be the charge against him, because they start arguing. Isn't this Joseph's kid? In other words, they can't see who Jesus really is. That is one of the whole aspects of John. Who is Jesus really, and what is Jesus' relationship with God? And Jesus continually, in fact, in this whole section, right? I can't do anything apart from God. God is the one who does this. God is the one who is part of this. Jesus' connection to God. I am with God and God is with me. All of this is present in this section, that Jesus is telling them exactly what his relationship is to God, who he is, and all of this, and the people cannot see. In fact, some of the disciples, and by disciples in this one, it meant part of the crowd, the ones that were starting to believe in him, but now start to walk away. The feeding of the 5,000 turns into a place where Jesus loses the crowd, not gains them, as in the other gospels. In this one, when Jesus refuses to do another sign, essentially, and explains exactly who he is and his relationship with God, the followers and his newer disciples say, no, this is too hard. I can't understand any of this. And so Jesus turns to the original 12 and says, are you willing to still follow? And we get that great line from Peter. Where else are we to go? In other words, the 12 are the true disciples. Jesus has lost the crowd at this point. They no longer believe in him. They saw the sign of the loaves and fish and still ask for another sign in addition to that. But his true 12, except for one, again, John looking in the future, or I should say, John from the future looking in the past, knowing that one is going to betray him, I should say. And so Peter, in this instance, where else are we to go? I mean, at this point, they are believers. They're in for the long run. And so Jesus continues along the way. But this, Peter's confession, right, or question, I should say, where else are we to go, is the end of the Passover narrative. So the second Passover has now happened. And just, again, follow the different Passovers. Because the next time we come to Passover, in the third year of Jesus' ministry, is when Peter is going to deny who Jesus is, right? So right now, Peter is in for it, but even with a question. And the third Passover, Peter is going to deny who Jesus is. So keep the Passovers going, because we're about to enter into the Festival of Booths, or as we go into there. And so, or Sukkahs, I was about to say, which is still celebrated to this day. I've been part of a Sukkah ceremony and invited into one of the booths or Sukkahs. And so, we're going to move into another section, not necessarily another transition, because we're still in kind of the second year of Jesus's ministry, but there's going to be some significance about that festival. So here we are on Passover. For those that need a remembrance, this was the way that God saved the Jewish people from slavery, right? The Spirit passed over their houses if they put blood of the lamb on their door frames, and the Egyptians' firstborn were killed. So it's all about salvation. It's all about God saving the people. And so here Jesus gives them loaves and fish, recalling the manna. Again, this is my interpretation. The professor had a different one, but again, there's a debate between the two, so it's not like I'm off the rails here. But for me, as I said, the connection from Passover to manna, and yet the people reject Jesus still, which is what they're going to do to God eventually. They're going to reject God when they get into the promised land. So it's following the same pattern, in other words, as the Exodus narrative. So keep that kind of in mind as we read the Gospel of John. Where does the crowd go? What do they do? How do they believe? Because again, this is going to be the same crowd that will call for Jesus's death later on. So thanks for joining me again another week, and we'll see you next week as we move into the Festival of Booths. Take care, everybody.